So today we're going to talk about the comparative analysis of the grassroots organizers and policymaking reformists. Let's get started. First, we're going to talk about what the factors were for the grassroots. By the early 1960s, civil rights activists felt that they had been essentially denied the opportunity to come to the table to talk about specific reforms and laws that they felt were unjust. The Mexican Americans, for example, and the Church of Cesar Chavez. Many accounts of police brutality in the face of non-violent protest were happening, and that was from the Malcolm X interview. Grassroots organizers had only themselves to rely upon because they did not feel supported from institutions like the church and sympathetic lawmakers. Each of these constantly told them they needed to tone down the aggressiveness if they wanted to bring people together and enact real change, which was from a letter from a Birmingham jail. These are a couple pictures which I found which talk about, or which kind of show the police brutality and what was going on. It shows one individual outside of a courthouse being kind of brutalized, and also just individuals outside being brutalized by the police as well. Now let's talk about the perspectives of the grassroots. So there was a few of them. First, let's talk about the hopelessness. No form of direct action was palatable. That's the whole reason the grassroots movement came to exist, because no matter how much they tried, there was no action happening. First, we could talk about Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael and how they talked about that a lot, and that a liberation for oppressed people could not come at the mercy of the people in power, but rather with oppressed people seizing the means of power, which is kind of a definition of what grassroots stands for. Nonviolence was very popular under figures like MLK and Gandhi, so most people prefer to strike or boycott and stuff like that, from a 1968 Cesar Chavez video, how he explained. But they all understood how nonviolence was interpreted as radical and too far by people who had no interest in fulfilling their demands and would poke holes in their methods no matter what they did. So they had frustration. Supposedly sympathetic institutions were always finding reasons to reject their methods. Think about this. If you commit violence, that is radical. That is too far. So then these people are committing non-violent protests, and even then they're calling them too aggressive and too far. Non-violence was highly preferred, but understanding that violence was an inevitable consequence of rejection. The issues were systemic. They critiqued specific events and policies less than the overall history of oppression. These pictures signify kind of what was going on and what the grassroots movement was made of. The right picture shows that these grassroots movement individuals were actually just on the bottom of the totem pole, the workers, the farmers, and how they, no matter what they did to kind of fight the oppression, to fight for change, they would be considered aggressive and radical. Now, let's talk about the goals of the grassroots. First, they were less rooted in pragmatics. They wanted to be part of a broader cultural social shift. When we say that we insist, we say very clearly that the only solution is black revolution, and that we're not concerned with peaceful coexistence. Armed struggle is the only way, not only for us all but us all oppressed people around the world, for a number of reasons. People who talk about peaceful coexistence are talking about maintaining the status quo, because the only way that you can disrupt the imperialistic system is when you disrupt it by force. You do not disrupt it with talk. The master has no business enslaving him. So all the slave has to do is get up and kill the master if the master refuses to stop enslaving him. That is the only solution. So it is crystal clear, as far as we're concerned, armed struggle, that is all, no time for talk. We have talked and talked and talked and talked for too long. You must disrupt the system by any means necessary. This was a quote by Stokely Carmichael at a Senate testimony. These quotes actually explained the problem in itself, that no matter what these people did, they were called aggressive and radical. So then turning to violence was their only option. Their demands were made to be less realistic than they really were. They were meant to transform the nature of a system that puts some over others. Carmichael talked about ending capitalism, giving power to many people rather than a few, giving marginalized people the levers of power, because those people are more likely to look out for the interests of others. This is a picture of Stokely Carmichael. And now let's talk about the factors for the government. Lyndon Johnson's government was faced with a big image crisis after Kennedy, who was seen as a social justice reformist, died. And this was from a convo between MLK and Johnson's. People were very, very upset by MLK's death, and a lot of riots were going down. While this contributed to the demonization of activists, this also made the government look like they didn't have things handled. They basically were in a position of appeasing both sides, pretty much a consensus that laws needed to be reformed, but with issues like budgets and congressmen who were racist, this often became a side note. This is a picture showing the march, and which was the greatest march pretty much in the history of the United States. Now let's talk about the perspectives of the government. Civility was major key. They only listened to testimony from experts and people directly involved with top levels of movements. There was discrimination against women reading. Non-violence of Martin Luther King was definitely preferred. They did not like their normal processes being disrupted, but couldn't deal with the actions they thought fell outside the realm of political okayness. This is why farm workers' boycott was so successful. This is from the Cesar Chavez 1968 readings. They like to focus on specific events and laws, like the disappearance of 2 white activists. This is from an LBJ and Halleck phone call, or specific segregation laws, for example. This allowed them to deflect social critique of the entire system by putting the blame on smaller scale things. This image is exactly a representation of that. It shows MLK at a Senate hearing, which basically brings him to on their turf, on their terms. The goals of the government were pretty straightforward. They wanted to do what was in their power as the government to solve these problems, as Lyndon Johnson talked with the farmer in a conversation. This allowed them to remain in power while gaining popularity, which was key for them, to push their agenda. They wanted to tear down specific laws, but not to change the culture. That's what we've talked about. That was the whole point of the movement. Now, there's 2 things here. There's a quilt that shows all the different movements, all the different things that was made during that time. And second, there is Lyndon Johnson shaking hands with Martin Luther King, which kind of signifies what was going on during the time, how the top levels of the government officials were gaining popularity by shaking hands and talking with activists, but not actually inflicting any major change. The impact. Grassroots organizers were more successful than the government because they gave lawmakers a big enough crisis that they had to allow activists to the table. Where we can reference the talks from MLK's letter from the Birmingham jail, where it doesn't make sense for people to hate on nonviolent protests when nobody would be paying attention to the problem. They were ultimately responsible for bringing issues of migrant worker treatment and African American rights to the national spotlight that wouldn't let people shift their attention. This forced lawmakers to do something about it. Congresspeople were always debating their suggestions and not coming up with bold new programs on their own. Lawmakers were more interested in budget and other things rather than pushing the agenda of change.